We're now joined via Zoom by SABC Correspondent Nick Harper. Nick, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you. I suppose it's just one of those moments in the history of a country that will always be looked at as a major moment.
Absolutely, Peter. I mean, this will be a huge moment in American history for the United States. Just consider that Roe versus Wade landmark decision has stood for almost 50 years. That was put into law in 1973, giving women the federal right nationwide to have access to abortions. That has all ended with the Supreme Court decision striking that down and saying that it is now up to the states to individually decide what they want to do about abortion rights. And for some states, that will mean an outright ban or severe restrictions. And the prediction is that potentially more than half of the 50 American states will impose very, very strict measures, meaning that somewhere in the region of potentially 36 million women will no longer have access to abortion that they have been able to have for the past 49 years. As President Biden pointed out at one stage during that speech, that is a right that most women in the country have had for the whole of their lifetime. It was perhaps already in law when they were born. It's something that they've grown up with, knowing that they had that right to abortion access. But that has been struck down, and it will have a huge impact, not just today with that decision being made, but in the weeks, months, and potentially years to come in the US.
Help our viewers and people perhaps outside the country looking in to understand what's at the root of this. Is it politics? Is it religion? Is it a combination of both perhaps?
Well, it's a little bit of both. You have to remember that the Supreme Court, the highest court in America, has the potential to rule on any case that is presented before us. And so often, the rulings that it makes decisions on, the cases that are presented before it, are the most controversial, most weighty decisions, the ones that very much split people down political lines. For example, just a day ago, they ruled on gun control issues. Now they're ruling on abortion. And yes, it does, for a large part, come down to politics. At the moment, the US Supreme Court, which is made up of 9 justices, has 6 conservative justices and 3 liberal justices. Now, it's a lifetime appointment for a justice. You hold that position for many, many years until you retire or you die of old age. So those vacancies don't come up very often. But the former president, Donald Trump, had the opportunity during his 4-year term, quite incredibly, to fill 3 vacant positions on the Supreme Court. Now, some presidents would be lucky to even get the opportunity to fill 1 vacancy, but President Trump had the ability to fill 3 vacancies, and he put 3 conservative justices in position, swinging the court in a conservative-leaning way. And we've seen that all 6 of those justices voted in favour of changing these abortion laws. So with that type of balance on the court, any contentious issue that comes before them has the possibility of being ruled upon in a more conservative way, and that is certainly what has happened as a result of these laws when they govern abortion here in the US.
It is interesting as you speak and you say this, because one would think the law is black and white. One would think that looking at the same set of facts, you should come up with the same decision time and time again. But here we're getting a sense that whoever is sitting in the Supreme Court, whether they're conservative or democratic or liberal, whatever you want to call it, that the law will be interpreted the way that suits the political narrative of the majority.
Absolutely. And we could see a situation where in however many years' time, the leaning of the court will swing back towards the liberal justices. So therefore, cases brought before it might have liberal leaning outcomes as opposed to conservative outcomes. So yes, it is very much down to politics. It's very much down to who is in the White House when a vacancy comes up, whether it's a conservative that they put in position or a liberal. So yes, politics playing a huge part part in these decisions, these very, very weighty decisions that affect all of the 330 million people here living in the country?
There were mutterings and murmurs about the power that Joe Biden has to expand the Supreme Court and shift the balance once again. Is that something that can be seriously considered, or is it just sort of maybe taboo?
Well, it's certainly something that can be considered, but it could be considered now when we have a Democratic president in position, or it's something that could be considered when there's a Republican president in the White House. So President Biden may look to extend the court, but then if we had a change of a party that's in the White House, the Republican could change it either the other way or expand it even further to give a supermajority to the Conservatives. It's also something that's very difficult for a president to actually enact. It needs a congressional approval, and at the moment the Democrats only have a wafer-thin majority in the Senate. Getting it past the Senate would be very, very difficult. But there is another legal avenue that the president was suggesting during the course of that speech that we heard a moment ago. He's suggesting that Democrats fight to enshrine abortion rights into law. So Democrats would put forward a bill. It would then need to pass both the House and the Senate, and those abortion rights would be set in stone legally across the whole of the country, overriding the ability for individual states to set their own laws and their own regulations. But again, the problem for the Democrats at the moment, with such a slim majority, that proposition is very, very unlikely to pass if it were to be presented before the floor, as it currently stands with those majorities in both the House and the Senate.
Is it a voting issue? I mean, is it something that any candidate, local government level, federal, national, has to always consider?
Well, it is. I mean, certainly, for example, if you're in a Republican state, which therefore has more conservative-leaning views, it is very difficult to come out and say that you think that abortion should happen, that should be the law of the land. You're unlikely to have that as a vote-winning proposition if you're presenting that to Republican voters in a red-leaning state. But the Democrats are now saying that they want to make it a voting issue in the midterm elections in November. The president is pushing Democrats to go to the ballot box in November. Midterm elections, often the turnout isn't that high, but the president is saying, look, now's your chance to try and take back the power. Go to the ballot box, vote in Democrat representatives so that they can try and change the law at some point further down the line. I think it's also interesting to note that abortion rights, at the beginning of this year, it was not thought to be even on the long list of priorities that people had on their minds when they went to these midterm polls in November, especially at the moment. The cost of living, when inflation at a 40-year high, is very much forefront of people's minds. It's come up time and time again in surveys in recent months. But now suddenly we have the issue of abortion rights, which has catapulted itself onto the short list of priorities that people will be thinking about, very much now making it a midterm issue in a way that really was inconceivable at the start of this year.
Explain to us why this has become, I mean, access to abortion has become a wealth issue and a poverty issue.
Yeah, that's right. It's something that the politicians have spoken about, especially the Democrat politicians, saying that it will impact particularly people of color, poorer minority groups within the United States, often because they are in states that are Republican-leaning and perhaps have far less access in terms of healthcare facilities and where they are located in the state, and therefore would have to travel much further distances. Just for example, the state of Texas is a huge state, and yet there are pockets of extreme rural poverty where the abortion clinics are very few and far between. That is only now being made worse by new laws that the state of Texas has been putting reaching in to make it much more restrictive, that access, making it much harder for people to get an abortion, criminalizing the matter so that if a doctor performs an abortion, they can face potentially 10 to 15 years in prison. So therefore, the next possibility for that person who lives in rural Texas is to go to a state where they can get abortion access. But Texas is surrounded by some other Republican-leaning states. They have to travel a very long way to get to somewhere where they could potentially get an abortion. And that's why we're seeing some states like California, Oregon, Washington State, very liberal states, saying that they will become safe havens for people who want to get an abortion. But that still doesn't quite solve the issue or the problem of how someone in rural Texas gets all the way to those states, how they pay to get there and then pay to get that access to healthcare. So it is an impact which will certainly be felt by minority and poorer groups across the US.
Nick Harper, thanks very much indeed for explaining all of this and the historic significance of this decision. Let's see what happens in the coming days. No doubt the people will express themselves one way or another. Thanks for your time.